Welcome, everybody, to the National Health Council's third in our series on clinical outcome assessment. Today, we will be discussing the topic Untangling the Terms, Endpoints, Items, Outcomes, PROs, PROMS, and ProPMs. There's even more terms that we'll be going over today. Ashley, could you please advance the slide? You can go to the next slide, please. So before we get started and introduce our speaker, Ashley Slagle, I wanted to just go over some housekeeping information, provide an outline for the presentation, and then also just review some terms that we've previously reviewed. But for those of you who it's your first webinar, you might find it useful. In terms of housekeeping items, we'll be muting everybody for the duration of the call. However, if you have questions, please use the chat feature. If you're looking at the WebEx, it's on the bottom or the top where the toolbar is. And you can identify it. It's the little text bubble. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type those in. We'll be monitoring them throughout the webinar presentation. If it's a clarifying question that's relevant to a particular slide, we'll go ahead and ask Ashley to touch upon it right away. Otherwise, we'll be collecting the questions, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to pose those questions to Ashley. So we'll go over the terms, as I mentioned, and those are really just providing an overview of clinical outcome assessment and then also differentiating between patient-reported and patient-centered outcomes. Ashley will introduce additional terminology and provide examples in drug development. We'll have a question and answer for about the last 20 to 25 minutes or so. And also a reminder that our next webinar will be on February 20th from 1 to 2. We'll have more information about that at the end, and then following this webinar, we'll also be circulating that information. So you'll be able to RSVP for that right away. Ashley, next slide, please. So just recall the objective of this particular presentation is to build on some of the concepts that we've covered in previous webinars, which are all available recorded on our website. And for this particular webinar, we'll be introducing to a patient group audience additional clinical outcome assessment terminology. And we anticipate that following this webinar, that learners will be able to use these terms and also identify example applications of the terms. This webinar will also be recorded and made available on our website, so if you'd like to review any of the materials, you'll have the opportunity also later. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we'll quickly review clinical outcome assessments. Again, this refers to these four types of outcome assessments that are listed on this slide: patient-reported outcomes, clinician-reported outcomes, observer-reported outcomes, and then performance outcomes. And then we'll also briefly go over patient-centered outcomes. So just a quick definition of what are we talking about when we're talking about clinical outcome assessment, or COAs. Many of you may be familiar with this topic because of recent FDA actions, and so we'll provide their definition, which is measures a patient's symptoms, overall mental state, or the effects of a disease or condition on how the patient functions. So simply put, a COA will tell you something about how a patient feels or functions. You can find also additional information. We've provided the links for the FDA's additional background on the bottom as a link, but next slide, please. So here you will see several terms that many of you might already be familiar with. In particular, patient-reported outcome measures is a topic that many are interested in today. And recall that this is a report that comes directly from the patient about their status and health condition without amendment or interpretation by a clinician or anybody else. And so this is, again, something where we're asking a patient to respond directly, and it's typically about some type of symptom that others wouldn't be able to provide details about. A ClinRO, a clinician-reported outcome measure, refers to a report that comes from a trained healthcare professional after observation of a patient's health condition. Also under the sort of bucket of COA tools will be the observer-reported outcome measures, OBSROs, and this is observation by someone other than the patient or a health professional. This might be a parent, a spouse, or other non-clinical caregiver who is in a position to regularly observe and report on a specific aspect of the patient's health. And then finally, the other sort of bucket of measures that falls under the COA umbrella is the performance outcome measures. And these are based on a task performed by a patient according to instructions that is administered by someone trained, such as a healthcare professional. Now, we often hear the term patient-centered outcomes and patient-reported outcomes, and so this is a point that we're constantly trying to stress, is that there can be overlap between patient-centered outcomes and patient-reported outcomes, but there isn't necessarily always overlap. And so a patient-centered outcome would be an outcome that patients report is important to them. So this is some type of potentially a symptom, or it could be some type of a clinical endpoint that patients say is important to them. Whereas a patient-reported outcome is an outcome that's reported by the patient on how they feel or function. And so you might imagine that there's often overlap between these, but especially in terms of patient-reported outcomes, since this is really just an outcome that's defined by a patient saying something, they may be saying something about something that's not that interesting to them or that important to them for their decision making. And so just to stress the point that there can be substantial overlap, but there's not always overlap here. And this was actually the topic of the webinar in November. So if you're interested in learning more about this, please go ahead and check that webinar out. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Ashley Slagle. Dr. Slagle is the principal of Aspen Consulting, where she provides strategic, regulatory, and scientific advice to drug development stakeholders on matters related to patient-focused drug development, with a particular focus on patient-relevant endpoints and COAs. She previously served as scientific coordinator for the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research Drug Development Tool COA Qualification Program. So we're very excited to have Ashley today presenting. She's certainly an expert in this area, so feel free to ask any questions. And as I mentioned, clarifying questions we'll ask right away during the duration of the presentation, and other questions we will get to towards the end of the presentation. So Ashley, please go ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. And I'd like to thank the National Health Council for inviting me to give this webinar. You know, my charge here is to go through a list of terms, and I know that sometimes isn't the most exciting thing for audiences to hear, but I think it's really, really important. So I've seen a lot of times where people talk past each other because they're using different definitions for terms, and so that we can all communicate better, I think it's really important to have a common understanding of the different terms, especially around patient-reported outcomes, because they're so critically important to both drug development, but also quality improvement in healthcare systems. So thank you to the National Health Council, and thanks to everyone who's joined the webinar today. I will be going through a number of terms, and hopefully your eyes won't glaze over. I tried to provide some examples to try to make some of this a little bit more tangible and understandable. So here are the terms that we'll cover, and I'm going to walk through each of these in detail with examples. Some will be review. I know that everyone here on the call is probably familiar with patient-reported outcomes and clinical outcome assessment, but for comprehensiveness, they're included in this list here. To get started, I just want to orient you to how the slides for many of these terms are arranged. In the top, the very top is the term, and then there's a gray box there that includes a definition from the BEST glossary. And the BEST glossary is a really great resource that defines a lot of different terms that are important in drug development or clinical research to both NIH and FDA. And I had the opportunity when I was at FDA to be on the team that put this glossary together. What we realized is that NIH and FDA and even people within the organizations were using these terms differently. And so it was an effort to put this glossary together with definitions to harmonize everyone's thinking about the terms. That said, admittedly, the definitions in the BEST glossary are somewhat complicated, and I think that's because it was an effort to be very precise. And so I've included those here for those of you who are really interested in the details, but I'd like to focus a bit more on what these things mean, how we use the terms, what are examples, make this a little bit more digestible to everyone. So we'll start with outcome. The outcome is just the thing that we want to describe as being changed by a treatment or intervention. Of course, a patient-reported outcome is that thing that, as Elizabeth mentioned already, is reported directly by the patient. There are examples here of patient-reported outcomes. So for the first example, symptoms of fatigue is the outcome that we're interested in potentially in a rheumatoid arthritis drug trial. And then symptoms of influenza may be important outcome to consider in an antiviral drug trial. These are patient-reported, typically patient-reported outcomes, but outcome can also include things like blood pressure in an antihypertensive trial. It can include things like white blood cell counts in leukemia patients. So their outcomes can be quite diverse. And of course, we all have an interest in focusing more increasingly on patient-reported outcomes and as well as other outcomes that are important, that are patient-centered, that are important to patients. So the outcome assessment is really just the thing that we're using to measure the outcome so that we get a score out of it that we can test. So the BEST glossary defines it as an assessment of an outcome that results in a reported data point, which really just means the tool we're using and how that produces a score that we ultimately can test to see if we had improvement on an outcome. There are different types of outcome assessments. There are biomarker assessments. So again, as the example with white blood cells, this would be the test or the process of counting white blood cells. And then, of course, there are the clinical outcome assessments that Elizabeth covered previously that include the patient-reported outcome measures, clinician-reported, observer-reported, and then the performance outcome measures. Okay, endpoint. So the endpoint describes how we will test the outcome of interest with using the score that's produced on the outcome assessment to see if an intervention had an effect on it. So an endpoint encompasses the outcome assessment, but it also tells us a lot more. It includes the analysis of the score, the time point that we plan to evaluate, the actual instrument or tool that was used to evaluate the outcome, and it can tell us other things like potentially how we might be combining multiple assessments from a patient into a single score. So the examples here, you see the endpoint is much broader than just the measure that we're using. So in the first example, we have the proportion of patients who had at least 50% improvement in their fatigue score on the PROMS Fatigue 7A short form at week 24 compared across treatment and placebo. So you see there's a lot of information there, but it's based upon first the questionnaire that we used to measure fatigue, but then it tells us how we're analyzing it, when we're analyzing it, and in whom we're analyzing. And then the second example is mean change from baseline in the score of an influenza symptoms patient-reported outcome measure, total symptom score at day 3 compared across treatment and placebo. So again, you see there's a lot more information here than just the tool that we're using. It also incorporates the analysis that we plan to do on that tool. So this slide is intended to show the relationship between outcome assessment, and endpoint. And if you take one thing away from this webinar, it's that the term outcome assessment, which is also sometimes referred to as a test or instrument or tool, that is not the same thing as the endpoint. They're not synonymous. And unfortunately, this is where I've seen a lot of people use outcome assessment and endpoint interchangeably, and it leads to some confusion. You can see in this table here, for example, in our fatigue and RA example, the outcome is symptoms of fatigue and RA. The outcome assessment, or the tool that we use to measure that outcome, is the PROMS Fatigue 7A short form, and then the endpoint is what we talked about in the previous slide, the proportion of patients with at least 50% improvement in their PROMS Fatigue 7A short form score at week 24 compared across treatment and placebo. And a lot of times when people have been talking about endpoints, they'll say the endpoint is the PROMS Fatigue 7A short form, but that doesn't tell us what the meaningful amount of improvement is that we're looking for, when the endpoint is measured, in whom it's measured, and so a lot of information is left out when that confusion is made. So endpoint and outcome assessment are not synonymous. Okay, concept. So the concept and outcome are basically the same thing. It really is, what are we interested in knowing about as being impacted by treatment? So if you recall in our slide on outcome, the examples that were there included symptoms of fatigue in RA drug trials and symptoms of influenza in an antiviral drug trial. And so both of these symptoms of fatigue and symptoms of influenza are outcomes that we're interested in, and they're also the concepts that we're interested in. You can further specify concepts to be a bit more granular when you start to think about measurement, so that you can see if these things are improving. You have to think about the concepts or the subconcepts that fall under the broader categories of symptoms of fatigue or symptoms of influenza. So if we take the example of the concept of symptoms of influenza, if we drill down a little bit into that, we learn that there are respiratory symptoms of influenza that are important to patients, and then there are often non-respiratory symptoms of influenza. And then drilling down even further, we can see what the very specific concepts are that fall under those different buckets. And so, for example, in respiratory symptoms, we're interested in things like wheezing, coughing, shortness of breath, and so on. So test, tool, instrument. We use a test or a tool or an instrument to measure the concepts of interest. So it's the actual questionnaire or measure that we're using to measure whatever it is that we're interested in knowing about if it's changed with an intervention. The terms outcome assessment, assay, test, tool, instrument, measure, questionnaire are all often used interchangeably. And that's okay. They all basically refer to the same thing, the thing that we're using to measure the concept that we're interested in. In some cases, some are more appropriate for others. So for example, you may use assay or test when you're talking about biomarker outcomes, and questionnaire is more applicable when you're thinking about patient-reported outcome measures. But generally, these all refer to the tool that we're using to measure important concepts of interest. When we talk about the instrument or test or tool that we're using, it's really important that we have additional materials that accompany that test to tell us how to implement it and how to understand what score changes mean when we see score change on that instrument. So for example, with patient-reported outcome measures, these different materials are often included in a user manual. And so this isn't something that the people who are reporting on the questionnaire would see, but it's really important for the researchers who are setting up studies to not only have the instrument itself, but also the user manual or the description of how to implement the test and how to interpret changes on the test or instrument. So here's an example. This is an example of a hypothetical influenza symptoms patient-reported outcome measure. So it would include the actual questions in the questionnaire. So in this hypothetical example, it has 7 questions asking patients about how severe a particular symptom was in the last 24 hours. And so we have the actual questions. And then there's a user manual that describes that this particular questionnaire is best administered on an electronic handheld device. It's assessed daily for 7 days at a time. It's scored in a way that each of the 7 different questions are averaged together to produce a total daily score. And then there are also guidelines in the user manual that indicate how much of a change on this particular instrument is considered to be a meaningful change to patients. So measurement. The best glossary defines this as the obtained value using a test, a tool, or an instrument. So with patient-reported outcome measures, we usually call the measurement a score. And so I thought, to me, it's helpful to think about this in a sort of concrete way using this ruler pencil example. So on the left, if we think about the instrument and the measure, that would be the ruler in this case. The concept or the outcome that we're interested in measuring is the pencil length. And then the measurement then itself is 11 inches. So the pencil length is 11 inches. Similarly, if we take the hypothetical influenza symptoms patient-reported outcome measure, then the instrument or measure is the IS PROMS. The concept or the outcome that we're interested in is influenza symptom severity. And then the measurement is that average total daily score. In this case, hypothetically, it's a 4. So items. This just refers to the questions, including the response options, in a clinical outcome assessment. So there are a couple of examples here. So this, the first one here is how severe was your coughing at its worst. This is one item from our hypothetical influenza symptom PROMS. And then below it is another example of an item taken out of the PROMIS Fatigue 7A short form. But you see, the items here include both the question and then the response options that we would ask patients to rate when they are responding to that question. So this is a diagram of a conceptual framework. When we're putting instruments together, we talked about their different levels of concept. So we have a concept of influenza symptoms. We have the concept of respiratory symptoms and non-respiratory symptoms. And then we have the very specific individual symptom concepts that make up those different buckets of higher order concepts. And so the conceptual framework helps us to organize that information and shows which specific items in a questionnaire combine together to give us a score for the higher order concept. So you can see here at the top on the left of the diagram, we have the cough item, the wheezing item, and the shortness of breath item. Those can all be combined, their scores can all be combined together to give us a summary score for respiratory symptoms. And similarly, you can do that with non-respiratory symptoms as well to have a separate score for respiratory symptoms. And then all of the items can be combined to give us a total symptom score on our influenza instrument. And this is important because in some cases, especially when we're evaluating new therapies, new drugs, some drugs work on particular components of a condition. And so it may not be appropriate to use a total symptom score in all cases. It may be more appropriate because the drug maybe specifically targets respiratory symptoms. So we would use that score in our endpoint to be able to understand what's happening to patients in terms of their respiratory symptoms. And so in that case, respiratory symptoms becomes our concept of interest that we would measure with an instrument to be able to evaluate treatment benefits. So this I know is review, patient-reported outcome measure, or PROMS. This is just the tester instrument that's used to measure patient-reported outcomes. So typically it's a questionnaire that patients are asked to complete, and then those questions are scored and some sort of summary score is computed from that so that we can test that statistically to be able to look and see if there was change with an intervention. And so again, the examples include the PROMIS fatigue 7A short form, which is shown here on the screen, and then our influenza symptoms as well is another example. So PRO-based performance measures, or PRO-PM, these are PRO-based measures that are used to assess quality and determine sometimes payments for care. So they're just PRO measures, but it's the way they're being used. They're being used to make quality improvements and again, sometimes making determinations about how to pay for care. To me, this gets a little bit confusing with so there's the performance outcome measure, and then there's the PRO performance measure. And these are two different things. So the performance outcome measure is one of the types of a clinical outcome assessment. So it's something like the 6-minute walk test or the word recall test, which of course is very different from the PRO performance measure, which is a PRO assessment that again is used to assess quality. This is an example from a report produced by Avalier that shows a PRO-PM for quality improvement. So in this case, the health system was collecting patient-reported outcomes for hip and knee pain patients, and then analyzing those patient-reported outcomes to inform quality improvement. And now they're expanding their collection of PROs for this purpose in additional conditions. And I think, to me, what's important here is if we look in the bottom right corner, the way they're using these PRO measures to be able to report back to clinicians so that they can judge the effectiveness of treatment and patient needs. They're also using these PRO measures to assess on a population basis what interventions are working best for which patients. And so going forward, having this information will allow them to better target interventions into the right, maybe subpopulation of patients for whom different interventions work better than others. So here's an example of how PRO PROM and PRO PM relate to each other. And so if we look in the middle column here, this example is patients with clinical depression. So in this case, the patient-reported outcome, or PRO, would be the symptom of depression. The patient-reported outcome measure, or the instrument tool that's being used, is the PHQ-9, which is a standard tool that's used widely to assess depression. And then in this case, the PRO-PM, or Pro-Based Performance Measure, is the percentage of patients with a diagnosis of major depression or dysthymia, an initial PHQ-9 score greater than 9, with a follow-up PHQ-9 score of less than 5 at 6 months. So in this case, it looks very much like an endpoint. So it's saying for patients who start with a score of greater than 9 on the PHQ-9 instrument, what proportion of them were treated successfully so that at 6 months, they had a score below 5, meaning they had meaningful improvement. And so to circle back, these are the terms that we've covered with our hypothetical influenza example. So you can see here, the outcome is the symptoms of influenza. The patient-reported outcome is also symptoms of influenza. The outcome assessment is the hypothetical influenza symptoms patient-reported outcome measure, or IS-PROM. Similarly, the test tool instrument is the IS-PROM. The clinical outcome assessment and the patient-reported outcome measure are the IS-PROM. The measurement would be the score on the IS-PROM. And remember that when we look at the different concepts, we have the symptoms of influenza, but we also have the concept of respiratory symptoms and an associated score for respiratory symptoms. And we have non-respiratory symptoms as a concept, as well as the associated score for non-respiratory symptoms. The items are the 7 questions and response options that are included in the IS-PROM. The endpoint, or an endpoint, because there are lots of different ways that we can set up endpoints. We have lots of different statistical analyses we can do, but an example is to look at the mean change from baseline of the score on the IS-PROM at 3 days. And then the PRO-based performance measure, again, there are lots of different ways that PRO tools can be used as performance measures. In this case, an example is that the findings are used at the population level to evaluate quality of care within a specific health system. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions, if the terminology is clear as mud. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ashley, for such a nice presentation. I have one question that's sort of a 2-part question. So I'll start off with the first part and then ask the second part after. Is one term that you mentioned a few times was meaningful improvement. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how meaningful improvement is determined and defined.
Great question. That is still, with patient-reported outcome measures, that's still a bit of an open area of research, trying to figure out the best way to do that. And so there are several sort of imperfect ways that we can do this. One that's becoming increasingly recommended by FDA and used by drug companies is to actually take the instrument into an interview study with patients and then directly ask patients how much change on this question or how much change on this instrument would represent something meaningful in your daily life. And so it really is gauging from patients how much improvement they would like to see with treatment. And so that's one of the key ways that it can be done. There are statistical approaches that you can use to set kind of identify what's the smallest amount of change on an instrument that is reflective of real change and not just variability in the instrument. But we often find that those statistically based approaches set thresholds that are too low. And so, for example, on our IS-PROM instrument, a statistically derived meaningful change threshold may tell us that 2 points is clinically meaningful. But then when we talk to patients and we ask them, they say, well, a change in 2 points wouldn't change my day. I'd still be in bed. I would still feel terrible. And really, for me to go about my normal activities or to get closer to being able to do my normal activities, I would need a change that's larger, maybe 4 points or so. And so at least FDA doesn't recommend using those statistically derived meaningful change thresholds for that exact reason, and rather finding a way to understand from patients what's important. If you can't do a research study and ask patients directly, there are some indirect ways where you can look at it in the course of a clinical trial, using some global assessments as anchors, and it's sort of a complicated process that probably is more than our audience wants to hear the details on, but the anchor-based approaches in clinical trials is another good way where we hear from patients on their global assessment where they basically say, I'm feeling better or I'm not feeling better. And we anchor that to the symptoms instrument to see what amount of score change on the symptoms instrument corresponds with those patients who say they're feeling better, to try to get an understanding of a meaningful change threshold.
Thank you. So now I'll follow up with the second half of that question was, is it different for different types of applications? For example, would it be different for quality improvement programs than a clinical trial?
That is a very good question. I think, so there are so many different endpoint applications and quality improvement evaluations. So I would say, depending on what your objective is, yes, you probably could have some different meaningful change thresholds established. But I think what is common across all of them is that fundamentally we need to understand what is a meaningful change to patients. And in some cases, it may be improvement. It may be a large improvement. In other cases, it may be that they're just not getting worse, so we're delaying progression of problems, and then we have to define what worse is. So I would say it's application specific, but with the fundamental question that we need to understand what's meaningful for those patients. And so there may be some similarities across the different applications, but it probably depends on what your actual goal or objective is with the endpoint and the quality measure to get to the specific number that you would use as your threshold.
Great, thank you. I just had one other question come in, which was regarding, for example, the two, on this slide you have the two top are, the example is symptoms of influenza for both outcome and patient-reported outcome, and then for technical instrument clinical outcome assessment and then PROM, the IS-PROM, the example for each of those. Would you mind just going over one more time how they're differentiated, despite sort of having the same example listed?
Why is the same example there? Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. The reason that we'll start with the symptoms of influenza for outcome and patient-reported outcome. The patient-reported outcome, that term, is just a type of outcomes. So the umbrella term is outcome, and the more specific term is patient-reported outcome. And so in the example of this influenza case, for symptoms, they're the same. The symptoms of influenza is both the outcome and the patient-reported outcome. We could also have additional outcomes in influenza that are not patient-reported. So we could look at, you know, the very clinical biomarker measures of that tell us how much of the virus is still left in the patient or circulating in the patient. And that wouldn't be a patient-reported outcome. It's another outcome of interest, but it's not a patient-reported outcome. And so that's why they're the same here, because in this case, we're thinking about the symptoms, which is a patient-reported outcome, but it's under the heading of outcome, where there can be other outcomes. For the outcome assessment, test tool, instrument, clinical outcome assessment, and patient-reported outcome measure, all of these, well, the patient-reported outcome measure is a subset of the other terms. And so outcome assessment, test tool, instrument are really interchangeable. Those are kind of the overarching, what are we using to assess the outcome that we're interested in. And then the clinical outcome assessment is a subset of those. Remember, clinical outcome assessments also include patient-reported outcomes, clinician-reported, observer-reported. So the patient-reported outcome is just a subset of the clinical outcome assessment. So again, in the influenza example, that was focused on our PRO measure. For outcome assessment and test tool instrument, we could have additional tools there. So we could have the biomarker assay or the test that's used to look at the viral load in patients as another outcome assessment or test tool instrument. That would not also be clinical outcome assessment or patient-reported outcome. But our PRO measure is a clinical outcome assessment and also the subset of patient-reported outcome measures. I'm hoping that helped to clarify and not confuse further.
Thank you, Ashley. I will ask, we had one other question come in, and I'll ask the audience if they have any other questions to please submit them now, because otherwise this will be our last question for this webinar. So the question was, well, there was a thank you very much for this presentation. Are there any other resources available out there for patient organizations to get involved with PROs, et cetera?
That is a very good question. So one of the ways that I'm seeing a lot where they're really good, it has been extremely helpful, is for patient organizations to become involved as research partners with instrument developers who are developing new patient-reported outcome measures. And so one of the things that's critically important when we develop new measures is patient-reported outcome measures is to talk with patients and understand what's important, understand how we should be asking the questions in the questionnaires. Again, that question about meaningful change. And sometimes it's really difficult to identify patients who are willing to participate in those interviews. And patient organizations have been really helpful in helping to identify patients who are willing to participate in that kind of, we call it qualitative research. And so, you know, working with some of the large consulting firms who I know are doing these interviews all the time, getting in touch with them to let them know that you are interested in partnering with them to help identify patients for qualitative research, I think would be really helpful. That's one of the things that really slows PRO development, at least in the setting that I'm in. So that would be one good way. Another way is to consider working on developing your own measures. This is a trickier area because there's a lot of time and resources and expertise that needs to go into developing measures. But I think that patient organizations can really drive that as long as they partner with the experts who can help make the scientific decisions and who are familiar with this type of research. But developing your own measures in collaboration with other experts who are measurement scientists, I think, is another way to get involved. And in some cases, doing that in collaboration with the FDA if the measure is intended to be for use in clinical trials. The FDA has the Clinical Outcome Assessment Qualification Program, where they work with outside stakeholders, including patient groups, to develop these new measures, especially in areas where drug development is slowed because there's no good outcome measure for trials. I think that's a third way that's really useful. And Elizabeth, maybe that's a question back to you as well. If you've seen other avenues in your work at the NHC where patient groups are getting involved or able to get involved.
Sure. Well, it actually is a nice segue into the final piece of this, which is to advertise our next webinar. So this is an area, obviously, that we know is a gap and that there isn't a huge amount available in terms of patient-friendly materials on clinical outcome assessment. And so we launched this series back in November, and we plan to continue through 2019. We'll be continuing with the webinar series and are also planning to have an in-person meeting this coming summer. So the next webinar will be on the 20th of February, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic of this will be successful COAs. It all starts with the concept of interest and context of use. And we will have a presenter from University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, Rosie Love, who will be presenting. So we're very excited for this topic and anticipate also good participation in that as well. Ashley, do you mind going to the next slide as well? And, additionally, part of this is we really want to make sure that if there are gaps in availability of patient-friendly information, that we're filling them. And so we have a standing survey on our website. It's available at this link. That is an opportunity also to submit topics. If there's something that you're interested in, please go ahead. How basic it is or how complicated it is, please feel free to submit it. It's from this link, and also at the bottom of our website we have a clinical outcome assessment portion of our website that can be a very good resource. But with that, thank you so much, Ashley. This was really informative, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.